So I'm going to pick up where Robin left off, but I actually want to ask you guys a question. So I'm interested how many of you have borrowed or lent money on a peer-to-peer lending platform such as Lending Club or Zopa. Can you raise your hands? So about 10 people. Has anyone used BlaBlaCar that Robin mentioned? 3 people. Okay, easier one. Who's a host or a guest on Airbnb? So about a third of the room. And how many of you have used Uber? So more of an Uber crowd. Okay, so I started studying these ideas in 2008. To be honest with you, it started out of curiosity. I was curious. I had a hunch that something big was happening, and it became an obsession. My research now focuses on a strand of the sharing and the collaborative economy, which is a very human one, and that is how technology is enabling trust to form between strangers in ways that are very disruptive to traditional institutions. So let me start by giving you an example. I admit I try and find weird and wonderful examples. This is a post that was, it's a real thing, I didn't mock it up. It's on TaskRabbit. Now, some of you may use TaskRabbit. They are described as errand networks. People post things that they need doing, cleaning, moving help, sorting through their house, and then other people bid to run these errands for them. Now, this is one that I saw posted, and I thought it was really intriguing, so I wanted to find out the backstory. Now, the backstory is that the gentleman who posted this had a bad back, and he bought a new bed, and the bed was too hard. So he wanted to hire someone to jump on his bed for 2 hours. Now, as you can read, he's saying, it's really hard, so I'd like someone to walk on it in relatively clean socks for 2 hours, maybe jump up and down. A little jumping's optional. It's a king, so your walking area will be 76 by 80 inches. Prefer someone with strong calves and some meat on their bones. Beer included, and you can pet my cats if you need a quick break. Now, many people would look at this and go, this is a complete weirdo, or we live in a crazy world. And the amazing thing is that 12 people bid to run this errand for this gentleman. Now, I personally think what this illustrates is the core ingredient of the collaborative economy, the core ingredient that really enables people to do business with anyone else directly, and that is trust. It's interesting to me, I'm going to challenge something that was said this morning, I think it was by Charles, where he said, you know, we probably all sit in this room and we go home and we think, I could have created Airbnb or I could have created Uber, and I don't think that is the case. Because when I talk to many leaders, brilliant people, the piece that they get is this top half. They get how technology is creating the efficiency for supply and demand to find each other in really interesting ways. They get that technology unlocks the wealth of assets, that it harnesses what Robin is calling excess capacity, and that you can make it liquid in really interesting ways. They get the business model behind the likes of Airbnb and Uber. But the piece that is really hard to understand is this social glue of trust, how technology is making us open to ideas and experiences in people in ways that were previously unimaginable. And that's the piece that I think is really interesting and requires a sensibility, a new way of thinking about the world. So sitting under this matching of needs and wants is a massive structural change that we've talked quite a bit about in this morning's session. So we often talk about how we're moving from the age of top-down, centralized, hierarchical organizations, which are really symptomatic of the industrial age. And we talk about how we're moving to these networks and marketplaces of connected people. But I think what is really interesting, and that we're just beginning to not even understand but identify, is a massive trust shift underway. Because if you think about institutional trust, It was created in the industrial age. It was created when we created this new relationship between people and companies. And when I think of the characteristics of institutional trust, I think of words like controlled and big and linear and centralized. And these dynamics, they don't work for the collaborative age. So we're talking a lot about institutional trust and that it's being eroded because of the reputation of leaders. But I think something bigger is happening, where the characteristics that we understand around companies, the way we think about building trust and brands, is dramatically changing. So one of the questions that I've been looking at in my research is if this way of trusting companies, if this institutional trust is moving to kind of a peer trust, how does it work? And the interesting thing is I looked at over 200 examples all across the world and saw the same pattern. It didn't matter the asset that people were interacting with. And I described this as the trust stack. So let me just pick an example that explains how this works, and I'll just pick BlaBlaCar because Robin mentioned them. So as Robin mentioned, BlaBlaCar is a platform. It's different from Uber. It matches drivers and passengers who are going on long-distance journeys. Now, people may have called BlaBlaCar hitchhiking. So the way it's evolved is that in the first phase of the trust stack, you have to trust the idea. You have to trust that this idea of ride-sharing is not hitchhiking, but it's a safe and sociable and better way to get from A to B. Once you've gone through that level, you then have to trust the platform. And this is really interesting, where you have to say, if I happen to get in a car with a total weirdo or something happens with the payments, I trust that BlaBlaCar, the company, the platform, will be there to help me and resolve this issue. And then the third area, which is really interesting, is how do I trust the other person? How do I trust that that driver or passenger isn't just safe, but is someone that I want to travel from London to Paris with? And this is where the research starts to get really interesting, because what we're seeing is how in the online world we replicate the same kinds of physical cues as trust happens when we meet face to face. And we're looking for these social clues. So just to give you the example, on BlaBlaCar, people share these profiles. So they share that they like music and they're not a smoker and they have a dog. But the identifying factor that people use, the social clue that they use to form trust, is how much they talk in the car. So if you don't like talking, you say you're blah. If you like to have a little bit of a chat, you say you're blah, blah. And if you're going to talk the whole way from London to Paris, you say you're blah, 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 which is where the name of the company came from. Now, this may sound really trite, right? But this is a $200 million startup. And my point comes back to how many traditional leaders, the traditional way of thinking about trust, would we sit there and go, okay, what is the social identifier that is really going to enable people to connect one another? But the fascinating thing is that what we're seeing is the more and more times people fall through this trust stack, the more they become open to these ideas. And eventually their behavior changes. So riding in a car alone starts to become the abnormal behavior. And then eventually the system changes. And that is what is incredibly disruptive to industries, is that more and more people are falling through these trust stack structures, making them open to new ideas and accelerating behavioral change. Now, the upside of this trust shift is really interesting, but it's also really messy. It is creating incredibly interesting and sticky questions around risk, accountability, and liability. So if you think about what's happening, it's pretty profound, because suddenly you've got this whole new relationship between providers and customers and platforms and providers and platforms and governments, we've never had to deal with this before. So one of the big questions that is emerging is, do participants, do the providers and customers really understand the shift in risk and liability? So a good example of this is, there's been some tragic accidents on Uber and Lyft, and it's very hard for the people involved. There was a 6-year-old girl that died, to sue the company. So the only people that are benefiting right now to these gray areas are actually the corporate lawyers, that this gray area is a dream for them. So we really have to have these tough conversations as to how does risk and liability change in a world of platforms and peer-driven participation. The second that I often find myself in the firing line around is how well these peer platforms can regulate themselves. And this is actually sort of the start of a bigger question, which is, what is the role of government regulation in the collaborative economy? And I sit kind of in the middle between the entrepreneurs and the regulators and trying to get them to have a common conversation. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, but you hear the same thing. Online courses, they don't have to have the same standards and accreditation of universities. People on Airbnb, they're not professional hotels. They're not held to the same food and safety standards. People in Uber, of course, are not licensed taxi drivers. And the interesting question is whether these institutional trust measures even matter to people. So let's just take Uber because it is so topical at the moment. These are just photos that I grabbed from protests from the taxi industries around the world that took place in Europe last summer. And they turned into full-on riots. Now, I actually spoke to many of these taxi associations and said, what were you hoping to achieve by going out there and publicly saying that Uber should be banned? And their response was really interesting. What they thought would happen was that the public would come out and say, Uber isn't safe. Governments should ban this from around the world. And they were genuinely surprised when the opposite happened. So this is just one tweet that I grabbed. This guy is Matt Hancock. He is the Minister for Business in the UK. And he's like, does anyone have details of this Uber app everyone's talking about? It sounds awesome. I've never heard of it in today. And sign-ups increased by 850% in 24 hours. Now, this is a really serious point, because the fascinating thing to me about technology and trust and these regulatory issues that are starting to emerge is the belief that somehow we can magically reverse the story, that somehow we can magically change human behaviors and go back to the old way of doing things. And the real question for regulators is actually to change their mindset, to think bigger picture as to the role of government regulation in these peer-to-peer driven platforms. Which brings me to my last point, and something that is really fascinating, and that is the role of online trust and how it can influence our behaviors in the physical world. So how these reputation and rating systems can actually make us more accountable. So let me just finish with a light-hearted example. It's a personal one of mine. I always try and document how my own behaviors are changing. I took this photo in the Disney Swans Hotel in Florida. Never go there. It is not a nice place. But sorry. You know how they have those rain showers? I don't know who invented the rain shower. And then not only just the rain shower, but the open shower door. It's a silly invention, right? Because the water goes everywhere. So I had one of these showers, and then I looked behind me, and there was like a minor flood on the floor. So I threw all these towels down, and then I was running out the bedroom, and I looked behind, and I had this sort of moment where I said, I would never do this as a guest on Airbnb. And the reason why is I walk out that hotel and no one knows who I am and my behavior doesn't follow me. But on Airbnb, I am rated as a host and I am rated as a guest. And this is really phenomenal. We're interacting with these things, but we are just starting to understand how online tools, how the digital world will change our physical behaviors in dramatic ways. And I'm married to a lawyer, and I often joke, can you imagine if lawyers had reputation systems, like how their billing would change? Or I recently bought a house and I got gazumped 3 times, and I said to the real estate agent, Google me, because I am going to invent a reputation system for real estate agents and you will have 0. But the point being that we are just starting to understand, for better or worse, how they will change our behavior and create new forms of accountability. So the thought that I want to leave you with is perhaps the disruption happening in the world today, when we look back, not in 10 years' time, but in 50 years' time, perhaps the disruption happening today isn't about technology. It's actually about how technology is enabling a profound shift in trust that is opening up new and sometimes counterintuitive ways of designing systems that I believe is going to change human behavior on a massive scale. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.